Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to speak to you today about genetic counseling post the SCOTUS gene patent decision, fast forward. For those of you who are familiar with cancer genetics, you know that the last year has been quite chock full for the field of cancer genetic counseling and testing. And much of this started in May of 2013 when Angelina Jolie wrote an editorial in the New York Times stating that she carried a BRCA1 mutation and had in fact had a preventative bilateral mastectomy. And we know that referrals to centers like Yale Cancer Genetic Counseling increased by about 70% that day. And although they've dipped back down, they've never quite reached the normal level. And so that brings me to BRCA1 and 2. For those of you who don't work in this field every day, we're going to do a quick review. BRCA1, not pronounced BRCA1, by the way, stands for breast cancer 1. And we know that it was cloned in 1994 and that we all carry 2 copies of BRCA1, one on the chromosome 17 inherited maternally and the other on chromosome 17 inherited maternally. We know that women who inherit a mutation in BRCA1 have an increased rate of developing breast and ovarian cancer, and that men who carry a mutation have an increased risk of developing prostate cancer. BRCA2 is a completely different gene on a completely different chromosome, but it's also associated with a high risk of both breast and ovarian cancer in women who carry a mutation in this gene, and an increased rate of prostate cancer in men. And we're beginning to learn now that the prostate cancer, particularly with BRCA2 carriers, tends to be earlier onset prostate cancer, and unfortunately it's often aggressive. We know that pancreatic cancer is also increased in BRCA1 and 2 carriers, but particularly with BRCA2, and it's found in men and women, and that the risk of male breast cancer is also highest in male BRCA2 carriers. There are mutations in BRCA2 found all over the world in every ethnic background. No ethnic background is exempt, and they're found throughout BRCA1 and 2 in terms of location within the genes. 3 of those mutations, I should say, are found again and again and again in people of Ashkenazi Jewish ancestry, or in fact, I would even say Jewish ancestry, because we see them in Jews who are not of Eastern European descent as well. And the carrier rate there is 1 in 43. For people who carry a mutation, we know that for women who carry a BRCA1 mutation, that the lifetime risk of breast cancer is somewhere between 55 and 85%. And you can see that the lifetime risks with BRCA2 are similar. Compare that to the general population risk, which is 11 to 13%. And you can see that those are greatly elevated risks. We also know that because these women carry a BRCA mutation in every cell of their bodies, that they have an increased risk to develop a second breast primary. And so what this means, if a BRCA carrier develops a breast cancer, it's detected in an early stage. They have that cancer removed, they have chemotherapy or radiation, that cancer is gone. They still carry a copy of that mutation in every single cell of both breasts. Hence, their risk to develop a second or even a third breast primary is higher than it is for the average breast cancer survivor. We also know that cancer of the ovary is increased in BRCA carriers. So for the general population, there's a 1 to 2% risk of ovarian cancer. You can see that that's markedly increased for BRCA1 and 2. For male breast cancer, particularly with BRCA2, high risks of breast cancer between 5 and 10% lifetime risk, much, much higher than the general population risk of less than 1%. Prostate cancer is increased BRCA1 and 2, and pancreatic cancer, particularly with BRCA2, increased 4 to 8% lifetime risks. So what are the options for someone who carries a mutation in one of these genes? There are several options. Surveillance. So in this population, we're not going to begin surveillance at age 40. We're going to begin surveillance as soon as we know about the mutation if the patient is age 25 or older, or 10 years before the earliest onset of breast cancer in the family, beginning at about age 18. The surveillance is going to be more aggressive. It's going to include mammograms and breast MRIs at 6-month intervals. It's going to include exams by a breast specialist. And we know that the surveillance will also not only be earlier surveillance, it will be more aggressive surveillance. Chemoprevention, not to be confused with chemotherapy, is a medication that a healthy patient can take who carries a mutation before they ever develop breast cancer to reduce their risk of getting the disease. So medications like tamoxifen, some aromatase inhibitors can be used in this way, and we believe can reduce the risk in BRCA carriers immensely. We have a little data, but the data we do have suggests it greatly reduces their risks. The third option is prophylactic surgery, and again, this has gotten a lot of press in the last year. We do know that bilateral prophylactic mastectomy is an effective option for BRCA carriers. It's not the option chosen by all carriers, and it's by no means the only option. It's one of the options. And it does reduce the risk of future breast cancer greatly by more than 95%. In terms of the options for ovarian cancer risk management, they may look the same, but they're quite different. They begin with surveillance. And currently we have the blood test CA125 and transvaginal ultrasound. Unfortunately, this surveillance has not been shown to detect ovarian cancer at an earlier, more treatable stage. So that's not very good surveillance. The second option is chemoprevention, which in this case includes birth control pills. We know that birth control pills can reduce the risk of ovarian cancer by as much as 60%, perhaps even more in BRCA carriers. If it increases the risk of breast cancer at all, it increases it minimally. The third option is prophylactic surgery, and the surgery of choice right now is removal of ovaries and fallopian tubes. And we know that having that surgery, once the pathology comes back clean, reduces the risk of ovarian cancer substantially, again by more than 90%. So I'd like to talk now a little bit about my entry into the entire BRCA patent debate. And I actually was recruited to come to Yale to start the cancer genetic counseling program in September of 1995. And interestingly, there was no clinical BRCA1 and 2 testing available at that time. So we were meeting with patients, taking their family trees, and looking to see if the cancer in the family looked hereditary. And if so, based on the pattern in the family, giving the patient an estimate of the chance that he or she carried a mutation. And so, believe it or not, I mean, it's really not that long ago, people were making decisions about whether or not to have a preventative surgery, not based on whether or not they carried a mutation, because we didn't know, but based on what their risks were based on the pattern in the family. That was September. And so soon after my arrival at Yale, December of 1995, testing became available. And there was huge media coverage. Referrals poured in, and we began doing testing. And the exciting thing about the testing is that all of these patients who'd been making educated guesses were now able to have a blood test and learn if they carried a mutation in BRCA1. And we were doing the testing at the DNA Diagnostics Laboratory at Yale. And with antiquated equipment, it cost $1,600. And then a few short years later, the director of the laboratory received a cease and desist letter to stop all testing, that Myriad Genetics had patents on these genes that they had now decided to enforce. And that's when things changed. So even though, as you can see, the cost per base of DNA sequencing and synthesis has plummeted over the years, with the start date here shown at about 1988. The cost of testing overnight rose from $1,600 to $2,400 because we all had to send our testing to Myriad Genetics. And Myriad began advertising the testing. And these are, some of their advertisements. The only thing worse than hearing you have cancer is hearing it twice. And there was a lot of criticism of Myriad's ads and where they put the ads, how they placed the ads. This was not regulated by the FDA or the FTC. And so they didn't have control of the content to make sure that the pros and the cons were being presented. And they also launched some very smooth television campaigns that played in some wealthy cities across the country. And in my opinion, if you watched one of these advertisements, you would be convinced that you needed BRCA testing if your neighbor had breast cancer. And so a lot of women were scared by this campaign and had genetic testing. And what we saw is that insurance companies were being inundated with inappropriate requests for the testing. And so, not surprisingly, what they began doing is clamping down on who could get the testing. The criteria became very strict. And in fact, even today with Medicare, if a patient is over 65 and has Medicare, they cannot have BRCA1 and 2 testing until they themselves have developed a BRCA-related cancer. And so even for someone who has a known mutation in a first-degree relative, they will not qualify for testing. And so with all of the changes surrounding, in my opinion, the patent and the monopoly that was created by Myriad Genetics, I wrote a paper with Art Kaplan from the University of Pennsylvania called Direct to Confusion, Lessons Learned from Marketing BRCA Testing. And this article, having a co-author like Art Kaplan, landed on the cover of the American Journal of Bioethics. And suddenly there was a lot of attention and a lot of focus on what it meant to have a patent on a gene and what that was doing to the field, to the cost of testing, and also to patient care. And so soon after, just a few years later, we learned that there was a lawsuit against Myriad Genetics and then the U.S. Patent Office, and that the ACLU was behind this. And so this lawsuit was filed May 12, 2009, and it worked its way up through the court system and went to the Supreme Court on April 15, 2013. And as many of you know, June 13th, we received a unanimous verdict against the patenting of genomic DNA. And so things changed. And I had been asked ahead of time what my predictions were, that if patents were abolished by the Supreme Court, how would the field change? And I said that within 3 months of the verdict, I thought we would have faster, better, cheaper testing. And I was definitely wrong, because we had that within 5 hours of the verdict. And I love this advertisement, ding dong, in a unanimous decision, the U.S. Supreme Court rules that gene patents are invalid, finally opening the door for more competition, more complete and cost-effective testing. And so this is just a short table of some of the other laboratories offering BRCA testing. And I'd like to point out a few things here. You can see the discrepancy in price. And so some laboratories, Myriad specifically, still to this day charging more than $4,000 per patient for BRCA1 and 2 testing, and other laboratories, well, all other laboratories charging at least 50% of that cost, some even less. And I should also say that all other labs are offering something called BART testing as part of their BRCA1 and 2 testing package. So everyone who gets BRCA1 and 2 testing gets large deletion and rearrangement testing, but Myriad, I believe, is the only laboratory still charging extra for that, and there are still some insurance companies that will not cover BART testing. The other difference that I think is important to note is that the data sharing piece. So you can see that all of the other laboratories currently offering BRCA1 and 2 testing are sharing their data in public databases, and Myriad Genetics is not. And so that is a complicated and very controversial topic. And there are now entire clinical groups who will only use laboratories that share their data publicly. And there's some insurers who are moving in that direction, that they are not going to pay for any genetic testing from a laboratory that won't share their data publicly. Because what happens, of course, is that if data are hoarded in private databases, that benefits the company. It doesn't benefit patients, it doesn't benefit clinicians trying to interpret those test results, and it doesn't benefit clinical research. And I should note that it's interesting to think that many of our tax dollars are paying for genetic testing when you think about publicly funded insurance companies. And so it does seem like at least the data should go back into a public database. And so when other companies began offering testing, Myriad one by one was suing them, and that has not changed. There was another announcement about that this week. And I should point out that before the change in testing policies, which I'm going to talk to you about, my group published a series of papers, and the third was just published on errors in delivery of cancer genetic services. And basically what this shows is that although BRCA1 and 2 testing may seem like a simple test to order, a simple test to interpret, that what we found is that unfortunately that's not true. That many people are ordering the wrong testing, which at best is costing patients and insurance companies thousands and thousands of dollars in tests that don't need to be ordered. At worst, patients aren't having the right test. So just to give you some examples, patients with a test that would only be detected by deletion duplication testing are having full sequencing and told they're negative. And so we have some patients who haven't had their ovaries removed who've gone on to develop ovarian cancer. Other side of the coin, the interpretation is quite complicated. So some patients who actually carry a variant of uncertain significance, which turns out to be a polymorphism, have been told that they carry a mutation. And believe it or not, we have patients who've had a bilateral prophylactic mastectomy, just like Angelina Jolie did, to later learn that in fact they didn't carry a real mutation. We have other patients who've had either hysterectomies or oophorectomies or both for the same reason, later learning that they didn't need surgery. We've also had patients who have completely different syndromes. So two sisters with ovarian cancer who are BRCA negative and are told that it was lightning striking twice, when actually when you expanded the history to 4 generations, it was Lynch syndrome, and it was clear that it was Lynch syndrome, and other family members died because the wrong diagnosis was made. So that was in the world of BRCA1 and 2 testing. This is the world in which we now live. Now that the market has opened up, every other laboratory is offering panel testing, which has huge benefits and a lot of potential. And one thing I'd like to point out to you is that on this list is PALB2, a gene that has recently received a lot of press as being a new gene. BRCA3, I'd like to point out that it's not a new gene. We've known about it for years, and it's on many of these panels. But I want you to think for a moment, if people were confusing BRCA1 and 2 testing, and they can't order or interpret that accurately, what do you think is going to happen now that we're offering these huge panels of gene tests, and that most of these genes we have much less information about than we had about BRCA1 and 2. There are going to be variants of uncertain significance in these genes, And even for people who really carry a mutation, the clinical recommendations about how to follow those patients, and are they candidates for surveillance? If so, how often? What type? How about chemoprevention? How about prophylactic surgery? It's getting much more complicated. So I think we can expect that error rate, unfortunately, to go up. We know that some insurers, Cigna being the first on a national level, are now actually requiring genetic counseling by a certified provider before they will consider the cost of some genetic tests. And this may be the wave of the future, that we're looking at a system that's saying, wow, clinicians, unfortunately, are being encouraged by some of these genetic testing companies to hang up a shingle and be their own genetic counselors. The error rate is so high. The amount of money wasted of our healthcare dollars is so high, and then the results are misinterpreted. This doesn't make sense. We need to make sure that we're ordering the right test and interpreting it correctly, not only for the patient in front of you, but for all of their family members. Think of the long-term ramifications for dozens, sometimes hundreds of family members. And so the last year has been really impactful for the field of cancer genetic counseling. Now that with the Angelina effect, many people know about genetic testing, and it's really brought it from an academic clinical setting to the level of the coffee shop, that you can talk to people in a coffee shop and say, have you heard of genetic testing? And they have. And so what we're going to see moving forward, people being less afraid of genetic testing, more interested in genetic testing, which brings us to the next issue, which is direct-to-consumer testing. And I'm going to be using 23andMe as an example today, but there are other companies that either exist now or are in startup mode who are offering direct-to-consumer testing. And of course, what this means is that you can order a test, a kit online. It's sent to the consumer in the mail. They can usually spit in a tube, send it back, and have genetic testing performed. And so 23andMe has had a lot of press over the last few years, some good, some bad, for their DTC plans. And last Thanksgiving, the FDA ruined your plans to buy 23andMe's test as a Christmas present by shutting them down in terms of offering results for the genetic testing. They could still offer ancestry and raw genetic data. And so for $99, you can still get your ancestry data and your raw genetic data, but no interpretation. And so 23andMe has been grounded, but I'd like to say they're temporarily grounded, and they and other direct-to-consumer testing companies have not gone away. They're just halted temporarily. And what we know is that some of these companies are going to get it right. They're going to offer good testing at low prices with accurate reports that consumers can understand, and it's going to be an option for the future. And there will be pros and cons, but one of them will get it right. And so with that, I'd like to invite you to type in your questions about genetic counseling post-SCOTUS gene patent decision and this incredible last year of fast-forward development in the field. Okay, so we now have a question, and this comes from Nicole Thompson at Howard University Cancer Center. Do you think we will eventually do away with single gene or single syndrome testing and progress toward panels for all high-risk hereditary cancer patients? And Nicole, I think there are pros and cons, and I'm sure you've seen them as well. But I think that the one-stop shopping we're seeing with some testing companies saying that they're going to go away from single gene testing and only offer panels is probably not the answer. Of course, in a family with a known mutation, let's say a family with a RET mutation, I don't think it's really necessary in most cases to offer a full panel. It's going to be more expensive. We're going to have variants of uncertain significance that pop up. I also think from our experience at Yale over the last year, we were looking at panel testing compared to single gene testing for people who were presenting with what looked like hereditary breast and ovarian cancer syndrome. And what we found is that we had a lot of variants of uncertain significance, but very few true mutations in genes other than BRCA1 or 2 when there wasn't a family history that screamed leishmania or that screamed, hereditary gastric cancer and breast cancer. So I think the jury isn't out. I don't think that we should flip the switch and say we're only going to do panel testing. I think we need to look at some data and examine the costs as well as the pros and the cons, because if we're only uncovering more variants of uncertain significance, we may be doing more harm than good. Okay, well, thank you very much for your attention.